Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we talk about ways your company can mitigate financial risks throughout your global supply chain in these turbulent times and into the future. My name is Charmaine Gadaris, and I lead the Customs International Trade Practice at BDO Canada. With me today is Josiane Simon, Vice President of our Risk Advisory Services practice. You will notice during the discussion today that my comments will be more focused on identifying and mitigating risk with respect to the actual import of goods into Canada, while Josiane's commentary will apply to every step within the supply chain. Today, we're going to start off with an overview of the key partners in a global supply chain, then talk about challenges companies have faced since 2018 to date, and possibly into the future. We will then dive into a discussion on the key steps you can take to protect your supply chain and success factor indicators. At the end of the discussion, we have set aside some time for questions from the audience. Please feel free to type your questions as we go along, and you do so by looking to the right-hand side of your presentation screen. Click on the stage, then chat. You can type your questions on the chat wall. We won't be answering questions during the presentation, but we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. Okay, let me just see that. Jumping right in, you will see on the screen key partners in a supply chain. This list isn't meant to be exhaustive, as there are many more minor players, and your company's supply chain may look slightly different. But these are the most common players, and a disruption with any of these partners will have an impact on your company. So let's first look at transportation. So this is the company that you choose to move goods around the country or globe. Can include air, rail, road, or ocean. You can engage directly with the transportation company, or you may choose to use a logistics company to act as an intermediary. Your company. This can include your parent company, your sister company, or any other subsidiaries around the globe. Distributors. These are companies who take bulk inventory from producers or manufacturers and then sell to several other customers. They usually buy larger quantities at a lower price, which in turn pass on to the ultimate customer or your company. Then we have the manufacturers. This is the organization who produces the product you are buying directly from them, or they sell to the distributors who you may buy from. And finally, the customs broker. The customs broker prepares and submits information to the relevant government authorities so that goods sourced from another country can be released into Canada and then accounted for, and duties and taxes paid. Now let's take a look at some events that have occurred or are occurring that have disrupted supply chains and potentially had a financial impact on your company or could into the future. Let's start with 2018. The Trump administration started to move forward with the concept of a Make America Great. They made that slogan during their election campaign, and part of it was the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, implementing actions to protect certain sectors, such as steel manufacturers, and the concept of Buy American. With that, we saw a trade dispute between US and Canada, which led to a 25% or 10% duty assessment being put forth by the Canadian government on imports of steel, American steel and aluminum, and a handful of other products like pens and mattresses and boats. We had not seen the use of punitive tariffs by a country in a very long time, and it started a domino effect of such actions around the world. Companies were not prepared for these additional costs. Also, in the United States, the Trump administration implemented Section 301, or Chinese tariffs, which added to additional unforeseen costs. Moving ahead to 2020 or 2021 and 2021, we saw the introduction of COVID starting in the east and making its way west across the globe, causing manpower and product shortage and delivery interruptions. The NAFTA negotiations were finalized, and the new NAFTA, or the United States Mexico Canada Agreement, CUSMA in Canada, was implemented in July of 2020, bringing with it a new product qualification requirement forcing importers and exporters to review their supply chain. So what's happening in 2022 and into the future? Get my little crystal ball out. COVID continues to wreak havoc around the globe with respect to supply chains. We're seeing microchip shortages impact various industries, bubbling unrest with Russia, further transportation disruptions, most notable currently in Canada. As anyone that's been to a grocery store lately has noticed the empty shelves as the trucking industry tries to deal with Canada's vaccination policies. Josiane, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you to start the conversation of key steps to mitigate risk.
Yes, thank you, Charmaine. So we've summarized what needs to be done for an effective supply chain risk management into three key steps. The first one is identifying potential supply chain disruptions. With that, you will gain a good understanding of what you're up against. The second step is to qualify or quantify the financial impacts of identified disruptions on your organization. So then you'll have a good understanding of the costs of potential risk events to your supply chain and your organization. And that will set you up for the third step, which is to develop cost beneficial strategies to reduce impact. In fact, you will be able to compare the cost of disruption to the cost of implementation of strategies and establish which strategies need to be put in place. So if we dive deeper into the presentation. So for step one, to identify potential supply chain disruptions, we divided this slide into three elements: what you need, how you conduct it, and the potential outputs. So what you need clear, documented, end-to-end vision of your supply chain. You need to have a clear end-to-end vision of your supply chain process, from the acquisition of raw materials and components to the delivery of your products and goods to your customers. Consider mapping your processes. You should also identify all the inputs and third parties involved in the delivery of your services and goods. Second, you must have a close eye or and on historical data on internal and external disruption. So have in hand a list of real or near miss incidents that affected your organization in the past. You should also review the list of events that have impacted similar organizations in the past. So we can just to name a few. There was the August 2020 explosion in the port of Beirut, various protests that resulted in numerous prolonged railway blockage by protesters, just to name a few. Then you'll need to have also a good overview of all supplier contracts. Ensure that you have a good vision of these contracts. You'll need it while establishing your organization's vulnerability to disruption. So this is what you need. So then, how to conduct the risk assessment? So we won't go in detail, but we'll focus on the key aspects. Ensure that you have access to multidisciplinary teams. The risk assessment should involve individuals from all relevant business units of your organization: procurement, quality assurance, production, shipping, legal, etc. And by that, this way you'll gain from their diversified perspective. And this will allow you to have a more comprehensive vision of your risks. Then you conduct a systematic risk assessment for all sub processes. Remember, I mentioned earlier when I said what you need to have process maps ready. So if you have process maps, you'll be more equipped to conduct a systematic risk assessment, analyzing each step of the process and seeing how it can be impacted by deleterious events. Then, once you have identified the risk events that can occur, you can prioritize them by assigning likelihood and impact to these various risk events. And you can use a risk tolerance matrix to establish what is acceptable and not acceptable with regards to your operations. So this prioritization can be achieved through the distribution of questionnaires to key personnel and or multidisciplinary workshops. While creating your impact scale, you need to consider quantifiable financial impacts, but also intangible, such as reputational impacts that might have at one point an impact on your bottom line. So when we think about potential risk events, we think about natural disasters such as hurricanes. For example, the most impactful hurricane well, that affected the East Coast. We can think about Hurricane Sandy. I'm having problems with my headset, sorry. Hurricane Sandy that affected a large portion of the North American East Coast. We can also think about strikes in major ports of entry, such as the one that affected the Port of Montreal in 2021, or it can also be a major cyber incident affecting one or more key suppliers. So once you identify your risk events, then you rate the likelihood, the impact, and then you can prioritize according to the risk index, which are the top risk events for your supply chain. Then the output of this assessment or this review is the identification of single points of failure. So if with the process maps, with the risk events, you can identify where your supply chain might fail and prevent you from delivering your goods to your customer. Then you also have a list of the top risk events that have been prioritized according to your organization's risk tolerance, and considering the existing mitigation strategies that you have to overcome these risk events. Then, based on the identification of the risk events, you will also uh, have identified the risk treatment options. So you consider all the mitigation strategies that are in place, and then you can identify appropriate risk treatment options, and we'll go into that a little bit later. So in terms of, that's the first step, really, to identify the potential supply chain disruptions.
Thank you, Josiane. So as I said at the opening, I'm going to speak from more of a customs consultant, or looking at how trade disputes affect the supply chain, how you can identify those, how you can quantify those, and additional steps that that you can take afterwards to prepare. So the number one thing that I want to say is each company needs to have a visualization into their current state of affairs. Knowledge is power, and customs costs tend to be a black hole for many companies. So, how do you get this knowledge? First, you need to gather information so you can provide yourself with a complete overview of where your company stands on the global stage. Uh, Document the customs triangle for every country, for every vendor. And when I talk about the customs triangle, I mean the three key pieces of information that customs uses to determine the duty and tax outlay every time you do an import. And those three pieces of the triangle are: number one, tariff classification, or what your good is; country of origin, country of manufacture; and third, what the value is. So gather all of that information. And the third piece on what you need is really an awareness of international trade disputes and political unrest. And I spoke at the beginning of what happened in 2018, up until 2022, and we saw, trade disputes between Canada and the U.S. There was Canada and Europe. There was U.S. and China. So find whatever news source that you rely upon and get yourself up to speed. Find and get linked and sign up for daily news information blurbs from Canada Customs or the Department of Foreign Affairs, Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs. Knowledge. Get as much knowledge as you can so that you can make informed decisions. Again, how do you do that? How do you gather that information? You literally take a map of the country. Ask your purchasing department for a list of vendors and which countries they're in. Contact your customs broker, the Canada Border Services Agency, and get a download of your import documentation or import information, so you can see who your vendors are, what the products are you're importing, what the duty outlay is. And the output of that gathering of information is knowledge and a clear picture of your current state of affairs and your current spend, an awareness of potential disruptions, and a starting point to make decisions and do your what if analysis, which I'll talk about in a little bit further. further slides. So I just want to show you an example of what an output looks like. So these screenshots are taken from a product that I developed to assist clients to map out and literally map out the location of their vendors, calculate duty spend by vendor, by product, by country and value. And with this information, your country or your company again has a very clear picture of where they stand today in terms of duty spend. And once they identify any potential trade disputes by being aware and reading the newspapers and whatever other news sources, or subscribing to information that their customs broker provides, or subscribing to information that their trade consultant such as BDO provides, they can project the impact of what additional rising costs could be and the impact on the company. Josiane, you have a beautiful little, I don't even know, graph, I guess, right here. So can you please, Josiane, explain to us what's going on this graph?
Okay, good. So it's part of step 2, the quantification of financial impact of identified disruptions. So before we get into the quantification of financial impacts, I thought it would be beneficial to review a few key business continuity principles or concepts. On the chart that you have before you, on the x-axis represents elapsed time, while the y-axis represents performance. The overall chart depicts the intent of a business continuity strategy. What you want is to keep the level of performance for all critical functions, activities, and processes over the minimum performance threshold that is established there. This minimum service level typically considers the needs of your customers, your legal and contractual obligations, but also the impacts to your bottom line. In this example, the minimum service level, as you can see, is 1/3 of the desired level of performance. Your strategy must be designed to ensure your performance level stays above the threshold. This means that the SLAs that you have with your suppliers need to work towards maintaining that level. In some cases, so you see on this chart, the red line depicts critical activities, functions, and processes. So in this example, the client didn't want to allow the critical activity to go below the minimum service threshold. But in some instances, organizations can allow some processes, some critical processes, to go down to 0 in terms of performance, but they need to identify how much time they can have elapsed before it goes back to the minimum service threshold, and that's it's called the recovery time objective. So you have to set these objectives, and then for your internal processes, and then revert back to your suppliers and look at your contracts and the SLAs and ensure that these contracts and SLAs help you meet those objectives. So first of all, in order to do that, you need to list all your critical processes, and it's going to be based on the output of the risk assessment. And you need for each of the critical processes to identify what would be the potential impact of top risk events. We talked about a little bit earlier the Hurricane Sandy, or an explosion in a port, or a strike in a port, and so forth. So look at your critical processes, your critical product lines also, and establish what would be the impact of that event on those critical processes. Then once you can see how long it could stop your activities, then you can qualify or quantify the financial impact. And I said earlier, there's the dollars and cents in terms of financial impact, but there's also reputational impact that needs to be taken into account, because it will eventually have an impact on your bottom line as well. Because, well, if you have a bad reputation, you cannot deliver your products, well, the appetite for your product might go down. So as I mentioned earlier on the graph that I just presented, you need to set business recovery objectives and review the existing supplier arrangements that you have in order to meet those recovery objectives, and also all the mitigation strategies that you have in place to see if they are sufficient. So for example, if you have a critical function, which is, for example, a call center that you need to keep up 24/7, and you have mitigation strategies in case there's let's say you no longer have access to the facilities. but you have a mitigation strategy that is remote work. But if only 20% of your staff can do the work remotely, and your objective is an 80% performance level, then you have a gap that you need to address. So these are the steps to qualify and quantify the financial impacts.
Okay, thank you again, Josiane. So I'm going to circle back to the example I talked about earlier. So let's pretend I've gathered, I am CEO of ABC Co. And I have, listened to what Charmaine said, and I've mapped out my vendors across the globe. I reached out to my customs broker and I got all the information. I reached out to my purchasing department, and here I'm sitting with all of that information. And then on January 1, I open up whatever my news source is, Financial Times, and I see that there is a trade dispute brewing between Canada and China. And what they're sort of predicting in this news release is that Canada, and again, this is just a fictional scenario, Canada is going to implement a punitive tariff of 25% on all goods from China. So once you've gathered all that information and you know that you have a vendor in China, and in 2018 you exported or imported, I think it's $53,000 dollars worth of goods from them, and you paid 6,000 worth of duties, and the sourcing from that vendor is fairly stable, so you're looking to purchase the same amount from them in 2022. What happens if you have to pay an additional 25% on all of those goods from China, and you're looking at paying an additional $13,000? Can your bottom line cushion that? Do you need to make a contingency plan? And really, where I'm sort of going with this is, once you gather all of that information, you know where you stand today, and then you can start to project what would happen, and that's the what if scenarios. So again, knowledge is power, and you can use that to cushion your business from any additional unforeseen costs. Josiane, would you like to talk about how or how companies can develop their cost beneficial strategies to reduce the impact? We've talked about how, the knowledge is power, and they can figure out what they are, and then they can quantify them. Can we talk about ways that they can reduce the impact to their bottom line?
Absolutely. So, so once they have identified what the lay of the land is with regards to the risks, the impacts, and the costs of those risk disruptions on their organization, they can establish which strategies are best for them. So the strategies need to be aligned with your specific vulnerabilities and recovery objectives. So if, depending on the delays that you can absorb in your production line, well, it really depends on that, and various other aspects. So the potential strategies that we've seen is near or domestic sourcing. By that, you can avoid the impacts of international trade disputes. You can avoid costs and delays associated with customs. You can shorten transportation routes, so then you have less chance of disruptions with reduced transit times. It can also allow for more flexibility to have domestic sourcing, because you can hold less inventory, have smaller deliveries, hence more transportation alternatives and more rapid response to customer needs. It also reduces travel expenses associated with supplier visits. If you want to vet your supplies, perhaps it's you have less expenses to travel. It also reduces complexity for legal issues. So if you're in the same country, state, or province, you're likely governed by the same law, so it's easier to resolve legal disputes. However, the labor costs might be higher in your area. You need to establish if those higher costs can be offset by shortened transportation routes. With the variations we're seeing right now in transportation fees, which have doubled, in many cases, and Charmaine will be will be more comfortable talking about the transportation fees and their increase, and this in highly volatile situation, it might make sense to envisage domestic sourcing. So the second one is dual sourcing. Well, it's not, we're not reinventing the wheel here. It's always better to have two or more suppliers. What it also allows you is it allows you to geographically diversify your suppliers to circumvent the impacts of an upset in one region, provided that you, your suppliers are in different geographical regions. It could also prevent supply monopolies and drive competition. So you can ensure that no single vendor can have too much leverage on your purchasing relationship. If you have more than one manufacturing facility and more than one source to supply them, you can potentially reduce freight charges. For example, you can choose suppliers closer to each of your facilities and reduce costs that way. Um, it also allows for more scalability, which in turn allows you to keep up with customer demand. So that's for dual sourcing. Development of tighter relationships with suppliers. Again, we're not reinventing the wheel here, but what you need to do is ensure that your organization maintain discussions with your suppliers to ensure that your organization is as at the top of their list of priorities in case of disruption. This will allow you to engage in discussions. If you're not, you need to engage in discussions to be in their top priority. And if it's not possible, you'll know that it's amongst your vulnerabilities, right? And that you'll need to address it. So the fourth element on this slide is the implementation of in-depth supplier vetting mechanisms. So you don't take their assurance at face value. You need to go as far as establishing how they are vulnerable to their own suppliers. So you might consider asking for independent audit reports in order to have that assurance that they can in fact deliver the goods and services that you have for which you have a contract with them for.
Yeah, and what I'm finding, Josiane, and I'm going to take it from here from
Mhm.
you, is some of our clients are looking at whether or not they can produce some of the inputs that they've previously sourced from overseas, just to reduce, any transportation costs or any potential additional duty costs. That's not for every company, but it certainly is a long-term strategy. Um, Transportation, one of my favorite ones. Ask yourself, can my goods be transported into Canada using a different method? I talked sort of the opening slides about there's rail, there's ocean, there's air, there's truck. Each of those types, different types of transportation, have different delivery timelines. And I understand in some cases that there's certain products that can't be, and I'm thinking of lithium batteries, for example. Lithium batteries cannot be transported on an airplane, so you're a little bit pigeonholed, for lack of a better term. If you're sourcing lithium batteries from overseas, they have to come by ocean. That there's no train that travels from China to Canada as of yet. But where I'm going from that is, look at, is there a different delivery model, or do you have a contingency or a backup delivery model? Or, for example, if you're currently using air freight, and we know that some airlines are experiencing delays because of manpower issues, can your manufacturing timeline bear an additional costs or timing if you had to, ship via ocean, for example? Again, just take a look at what you're doing, and look at some contingency plans there. The other thing that we talk about or suggest is increase in inventory. So in Canada, in some cases, before a trade action or an implementation of additional tariffs is undertaken, they provide a lead time for importers to prepare. You may want to take that lead time to consider importing in bulk prior to the implementation of any punitive duties or actions to avoid additional costs. However, consideration must be given to the immediate increase in cost of inventory and possible warehouse fees. So that's one of those examples that you really have to visualize the cost, and weigh which is the better option. In Canada, Canada Border Services Agency offers several programs which give the opportunity to defer the payment of duties and sometimes taxes on imported goods until such time as the goods are entered into commerce in Canada. So, this program includes things like bonded warehousing or duty relief for eligible importers. So, what I'm going at there is even let's pretend you couldn't import a bulk shipment of goods prior to the implementation of tariffs and you have to, for whatever reason, you have to do it afterwards. Those goods could come into a bonded warehouse and you could pull them in smaller bits and pay the additional duty so that your bottom line can cushion that a little better. And finally, one of my favorite topics, the use of free trade agreements, completely underutilized in importing companies contingency plans. So Canada is party to 14 trade agreements. Many more than the United States. Those free trade agreements allow the duty free entry of qualifying goods into Canada. So once you've gathered all the information discussed on the previous slides, such as supplier location, what the goods are, you can start to do some research if there may be a less costly country to source good from. And when you're doing that, you also have to take into consideration additional potential transportation costs, etc. But certainly explore the use of free trade agreements. So, Josiane, now that we've talked about the who, what, why, when, where, how, let's sort of summarize everything into what the key success factors would look like. How do I know that my ABC code did a good job and I've got a good contingency plan in place?
Well, like for any good program or any good initiative in an organization, the tone needs to be provided at the top. Given the volatile context of supply chain, top management needs to communicate that supply chain risk management is a priority and ensure that sufficient resources are invested. And by that, I mean human, material, and financial. It's not something that you can do on the corner of your desk. You need to devote resources in order to do that properly. The second one is avoid silo approach. Risk is complex. It has interrelationships, and you need to have a comprehensive vision of them. And for that, you need to have a multidisciplinary team sitting down, identifying the risks, and then devising the solutions that to overcome the consequences of those risks. So you cannot develop solutions in a silo. You cannot conduct a risk assessment in a silo. So the third element is also in order to be able to quickly respond to incidents, you need to develop incident response mechanisms. So those response mechanisms, they entail that you can detect potential incidents early and perhaps link those the detection methods that you have to the sources of information that Charmaine just mentioned, to be on top of things, and to see things coming, then detect potential situations early, notify the appropriate individuals rapidly. You need to be able to mobilize your resources that will respond to this situation quickly so that appropriate solutions can be implemented fast and the consequences to your supply chains reduced. So that's
Yeah, so the final 2 points,
yeah.
Josiane, actually go hand in hand.
Mhm.
And what I want the takeaways for everyone to be from, putting my customs hat on, is to know and understand your business on a global stage so that when you've documented who your suppliers are, which countries they are in, each individual product that you source from them, and any associated costs. Um, develop a process to gather that information and maintain that information, and then use that information to be able to calculate the what if scenarios. What if the duty rates on my goods from China increase to 25%? Can my bottom line absorb that, or do I need to source elsewhere? Do I need to fill a warehouse? Do I need to pivot to manufacture in house? So in closing, from a customs perspective and from your perspective as well, the starting point is knowledge. Gather as much knowledge as you can. Do not operate in a silo. Understand your business in its entirety, on the home front and on the global front. So with that, we're going to. Well, I don't think we're going to stop talking, but um, we have this, these last 6 minutes for any type of questions. And Jules, again, I'm actually going to have to ask for your help. Did we get any questions that came in
I
that the
don't
audience?
see any. I
Okay.
don't see any questions here.
Okay, well, good stuff. Because thankfully, I gathered a couple of questions, and I know you gathered a question that we get quite frequently when we discuss this topic. And the first question is that I get is, do I have any suggestions for news and information sources to subscribe to so that you know what's going on the international trade front? And I did talk a little bit about that. Canada Border Services Agency does have a subscription service, and they send out daily notifications about increases in duty or really anything that you need to know as a Canadian importer. If you have a customs broker, I'm assuming they also have the same subscription service. BDO Canada, other accounting firms, other trade consultants also send out information to their clients quite frequently, and we, as do others, have this global trade page where we throw information up there. So I would suggest looking into some of those. And the other question I get, Josiane, is where do we get our import data? This is a favorite question. So there's a couple of different ways that you can get your import data. And your import data is a listing of all the products that you import into Canada, who the vendor was, what it was, how much you paid. You can get that, number one, from Canada Border Services Agency. So there's an application process to get that information. Or two, your customs broker has that information. You can make a request to them. And I would suggest doing that now. Getting that information so that because on the other hand, your customs broker is submitting that information on your behalf. So in the event of an audit, they're not coming after the customs broker. If something goes wrong, they're coming after you. So there's many reasons that you should be getting that import data and reviewing it. So Josiane, what's a common question that you get?
A common question or situation. Oftentimes we get calls from suppliers, your suppliers, that want to show patte blanche. We would say in French, patte blanche to their customers to say, okay, we have a business continuity plan in place that is effective, that has been tested, and we can guarantee that given this and this disruption, we can still provide those goods. That is a type of report based on the ISO standard 22301, which is the business continuity management system. Also because many of the disruptions are IT related, cyber incidents, to be more precise. It could also be interesting to get an assurance or a report from your suppliers to ensure that all their IT controls are in place and that they their operations could not be disrupted or by these situations, and that they have plans in place to overcome the consequences of those disruptions should they occur. And that's relative to ISO 27001 or SOC 2 report. So any combination of standard to ensure that the organization that is providing you your services and goods is resilient would be a good idea to have those reports and those attestations in hand for your suppliers.
Wonderful. So Josiane, if there's no other
Mhm.
questions from the audience, I am going to say thank you all for attending the effective supply chain management, risk management at every stage presentation. Please click on the stages icon on the left side and go to the main stage for closing remarks. Thank you all.
Thank you.